In pre-Burly days, when I was still a relatively young Herle, I was lucky enough to be inspired by my boss, Paul Martin, and his work to bring equal opportunity to our Indigenous people. So it's a subject I care deeply about. Last week, we started talking about the work TELUS is doing to better Indigenous lives through the power of digital connectivity. I can tell you from experience, it's not easy work. Not the kind of thing that just takes a snap of the fingers and it's done. There are barriers to overcome, and it takes the committed partnership of governments, federal, provincial, and Indigenous, working alongside TELUS to make anything real happen. But it's the right work. Listen to this story about the Innu women of Pakwashipu, an Indigenous village of just over 200 in Quebec's vast lower North Shore. Artisan crafting is a cultural tradition there. Folds and stitchwork on items like moccasins, clothing, and jewelry have been passed down from one generation of women to the next for centuries. In 2019, TELUS was able to bring high-speed internet to the area. Suddenly, there was a website for their work with videos and animations, language courses, crafting workshops. What was previously small commerce became a leading force of economic vitality for the community. So not only is Pakwashipu's culture being preserved and honored, it's being shipped to the rest of Canada and the world. And high-speed internet is the gateway to further education for the village. This kind of work continues for TELUS. You can read more about it in their just-released Indigenous Connectivity Report at telus.com/Indigenous Connectivity. All right, Herle Burlyites, welcome to the pod, and I thank you for being here. We've got a two-parter for you today. That's been our custom during COVID, and until there's an effective vaccine for a two-part Herle Burly available in this country, we're going to have to continue this way. For part one, I'm so pleased to welcome Margaret MacMillan. Ms. MacMillan is a professor of history at the University of Toronto and emeritus professor of international history at the University of Oxford. She's the best-selling author of a great many works specializing in British Imperial history and is the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. We'll talk to Ms. MacMillan about her new book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. And we'll also get into historical lessons relevant to figures like Trump and the worldwide pandemic. For part two of the pod, it's our ever-lovin, ever-cussin political panel with Scott Reid and Jenni Byrne. We're going to have it out over yesterday's economic update from Freeland. We'll talk about COVID vaccines in Canada. When are we going to get one? How are we all going to get one? Is it going to be late, and why? And finally, we'll chat about a very prescient Trudeau issuing a readout of his call with Erin O'Toole before his call with Erin O'Toole even happened. And geez, I almost forgot, we'll also continue with our new segment, Hey You, where we all throw a question out into the void for a politician or a public figure. Margaret MacMillan, really like to thank you for joining us on the Herle Burly today. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Where are you right now?
I'm in Toronto.
You're in Toronto.
Yeah.
Have you been camped there through this whole thing?
No, I was actually camped in the UK because I was there on what I thought was a short trip last March, and then everything closed down, and I thought, do I stay or go? And so I stayed. But I've come back and I've done my quarantine, so far so good.
That's kind of what happened to me with my cottage. I came up here on March the 12th for the weekend, and I've never left.
It seems like another world, doesn't it, before the beginning of March, where we could move around freely and go wherever we wanted.
How are you doing?
Pretty well.
It's like, yeah.
Well, not bad, because I work at home a lot on my own anyway. If you're a writer, you spend a lot of time on your own, and we quite like being on our own. And so I'm more or less used to it. And I'm very lucky. I've got books around me. I've got a comfortable place to live. So, I'm luckier than most people, I think.
Yeah. It's still weird though, right? I mean, even though you're comfortable and you don't have to worry about a lot of the things people have to worry about, it's a draining process.
I find doing Zoom or FaceTime much more tiring than actually talking to people face to face. And giving a lecture is really weird because you can't see anything. You're just looking at this little screen and this little sort of green light at the top of it. And I find it very odd. I really look forward to getting back to being able to sort of be with people and not being self-conscious and not worrying about masks and not worrying about shaking hands or whatever.
Okay, so this is the book we're talking about today. War, How Conflict Has Shaped Us. Extraordinarily ambitious undertaking, Ms. MacMillan, to write about war in general. What made you want to write that book?
Well, you're nice to call it extraordinarily ambitious. There were times when I thought it was just plain nuts. It was a subject that's always interested me. I'm an historian, and early on I got interested not just in history, but in war. And I focused when I grew up on the 19th and 20th centuries, and in those centuries there is an awful lot of war. And I just became interested in how much war has woven its way through human history and through human societies. And when I was asked to give, the BBC have a series of lectures called the Reid lectures, which the Massey lectures here are the equivalent. And when I was asked to give the Reid lectures, they said, any subject you like. And I thought, well, maybe this is the time to finally pull my rather scattered thoughts on war and what it might mean for human society and what it might mean for our values and so on together. And so it was really the chance to give those lectures that got me thinking. And then I did a lot more sort of work and finally did a book. I'm not covering the whole history of war. That would be impossible. But I'm talking about different aspects of war, which I hope will interest people and maybe make them want to read a bit more.
And what did thinking about, I mean, you know so much about history, thinking about it from this particular perspective, what new conclusions did you come to or revelations did you come to as you did this book?
I became a lot more aware of the impact of war on political organization. I mean, if you define war, as I do, as one organized group with a political goal fighting another organized group with a political goal, it's not just random violence. I mean, they have a purpose and they have an agenda, even though we might find that purpose and agenda pretty weird. But so if you think of war like that, and what I hadn't really realized was the impact that war has had on the shaping of states. Now, the strong central state or the shaping of empires, I mean, these were built on conquest, and they were built on the state getting a monopoly of power, which brought different elements within the state under control and also protected that state, and in some cases allowed that state or empire to expand. And so I think I hadn't realized the really deep imprint that war has left on the ways in which we organize ourselves politically. I mean, the whole growth of bureaucracy in modern times was driven very largely by the need to figure out what resources you had and how many people you had and whether you could fight or not and how you could defend yourself or how you could conquer your neighbors.
So, okay, the subtitle of the book is How Conflict Shaped Us. Let's start with Canada. How has war and conflict shaped Canada?
Not as much perhaps as other countries. I mean, we're not a country that came into existence because of war, but we've been maintained, at least in part, by the capacity of our government to defend ourselves. If the War of 1812 had gone a different way, we might not have remained as colonies of the British Empire. We might have become part of the United States. And we've certainly contributed into wars, which I think have enabled, in the long run, Canada to go on being the sort of nation it is. I mean, we participated in 2 world wars, and we made a very significant contribution. And I think we should ask ourselves, what would the world be like, and what would Canada be like today if the Germans and their allies had won in the Second World War? We'd be a society isolated, perhaps, more from the rest of the world. We'd be a society under real pressure. Difficult to tell which road the United States might have gone down on. And so war is not something that we've had the same experience, for example, as Germany or Russia, who had war fought on their soil. But war has played a part, an important part, I think, in making us who we are.
So let me just unpack that a little bit. God, I hate that expression. Why did I end up using it? How would Canada be different had we not participated in those wars? Let's say the Second World War goes exactly the same way it went, but we just didn't participate. Would we be a different place?
Yes, I think we would. I think by participating in 2 world wars, of course, it cost us. It cost us in terms of lives and it cost us in terms of resources. But it also helped the growth of the Canadian state. It caused us huge political problems, internal problems, which I think in some ways we're still working out. The conscription crises in both the world wars threatened the very nature of Canadian unity, but we somehow managed to deal with it. And I think we came through both the wars, different societies. We were more prepared to see the government intervening in the economy and in society. We were more prepared to see government direction of things like industry, mining, production, and so on. And I think we also developed a set of social institutions, partly as a result of war. Governments learned they could tax more, and they learned that they had more money to spend than they thought they possibly had imagined. But I think we also gained a realization at the end of both world wars that we needed, collectively as a society and government needed, to do more for Canadian citizens. And so the origins of our social insurance system, I think, come out of those two wars. They might have come anyway, but the war, I think, really made us realize that we had to do something for the underprivileged and the marginal in our societies.
Okay, so let's assume for the sake of discussion that I'm a coward and I don't like to fight. And I have made it clear my whole life that if I was ever drafted or conscripted, I would run and hide and flee, look for Switzerland, wherever I could get. I can only think of one war, the Second World War, that I would have fought in if I'd been drafted. And even then I would have been... Anyway, what are examples in your view? I mean, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, is the song. In your view, what's a just war? Are there examples of wars that were worth fighting other than the Second World War? Let's give that one.
Well, I think, philosophers have been grappling with this one for centuries, and indeed for millennia. And I think the general sort of consensus is a just war is one in which you're defending yourself against unprovoked aggression. That's a choice which some people have had to face in the past. What do you do if an outside and hostile power threatens your whole way of life, threatens to destroy your society, threatens to kill your families, threatens to destroy everything that you hold dear? I mean, that was the choice really that the British faced in 1940 after the fall of France, when they were left for a time alone with the British and the British Empire were left alone against Hitler and his allies. And so I think that is often considered a just war. A just war is something where you defend yourselves. What is not a just war is unprovoked aggression on your neighbors to take something that belongs to them. But I think we don't, I'm a coward too. And I've often wondered what I would do if I'd had to fight. Members of my family fought. My father was in the Canadian Navy. An uncle was in the British Air Force. Two of my grandfathers were in the First World War. I think we just don't know what we do until we're absolutely faced with it. The United States was probably majority isolationist in the 1930s. And even when the Second World War started in Europe, most Americans didn't want to get involved. Well, the day after Pearl Harbor, opinion had changed. And Americans, they flocked to the recruiting centers. They wanted to fight. And the same thing in Britain. Probably a majority of people in Britain didn't want to get involved in the Second World War, but once it started, they were involved. So I don't think we know. We don't know what will provoke us to want to fight. But so often defending what you hold dear seems to be one of the strongest motivating forces.
I have given a lot of thought to the nature of leadership and the difference between male and female leadership, because I was very closely involved with Kathleen Wynne, and I learned a lot from that exercise, both from her governance and from the campaigns around it. How much do you think that our historical propensity for war as a people is linked to our historically male-dominant leadership?
I'll answer that in two parts, if I may. I mean, I think women and men often have different leadership styles, although you will get women who develop or take on male leadership styles. But it strikes me that women, perhaps because they have been in positions of less power and authority over history, have learnt to be good listeners, that have learnt to keep their eyes open, have learnt to try and know who they're dealing with. And so perhaps we're more habituated, perhaps culturally, to compromise and working with people. It doesn't mean women can't be effective leaders. Often that makes them very effective indeed. If you look at Angela Merkel, for example, in Germany. But I think leadership in war, I don't think women are that much different, quite frankly. I mean, I can just give you a list of some of the women in the past who oversaw wars. Catherine the Great, who expanded the territory of Russia enormously through war. Maria Theresa, lovely woman, great mother to her children, but was involved in a number of wars. In the modern age, Margaret Thatcher, Falklands War. It's not clear that the British would have gone to war with Argentina over the Falklands if it hadn't been for her. I mean, she was determined on it. Golda Meir in Israel. I think when you get right down to it, women in positions of authority will often take their countries to war for very much the same reason men do.
That's really interesting, because we do have this impression, and your book is full of testosterone.
Mm.
Your book is full of the testosterone that leads to war and leads people to fight in wars. So
Yeah.
I genuinely thought women might be different.
I don't think they are. And quite frankly, I don't think testosterone is the reason why countries go to war. I think individual men may feel they have to test themselves and may have aggressive impulses. But when you think about war, it's a very controlled activity. It's highly organized. And often the people who go to war don't want to go to war. In fact, that's what a lot of military training is about. It's about overcoming their inhibitions against war and killing others and making them into the sorts of people who will do that. And so I tend to think, a lot of historians have argued that, and I tend to agree with them, that cultural factors matter much more in why people go to war. And war is a calculated business. It employs violence, but when you think of it, it's a highly organized direction of violence.
Right. But doesn't mean it's always rational, right? In terms of the processes that go into it, the thinking that goes into it.
No, it depends what we call rational. I think what is rational is self-preservation. And what is rational is not getting involved in things that you don't know where they're going to end. But that has never stopped countries from going to war, or policymakers from taking countries into war. And all sorts of things come in. I think we are not as rational as we'd like to think we are. And you get countries getting into wars for reasons of pride, reasons to show that they still matter as great powers. In Austria-Hungary in 1914, that country, that empire, was not prepared for war, particularly for the sort of war that they were going to get. But you've got people in Vienna saying, such an old empire, we have to fight. We have to show that we still count. One of them said, we may be going to destruction, but we should go down with a fight. This is madness, I think. But it's a very powerful factor. And we get it today. Nations talk about their credibility. And that really is, I think, their prestige. Nations will fight for reasons of honor, prestige, credibility. Sometimes they fight by mistake. Sometimes two antagonists will get each other wrong and think that the other side is planning an attack and decide to attack first. And sometimes it turns out afterwards they've made a mistake. So, there are calculating and cold reasons why groups will go to war, but there are also always the possibility of mistakes or the wrong sorts of reasons, or sort of gambling, thinking, well, if we go to war, we will be better off than if we didn't. And that's always a very dangerous gamble.
I'm incredibly poorly read and poorly educated, so every book I read makes a big impression on me. And I read, a number of years ago, I read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which you may have heard of. And It talked about how our brain processes work and how much of our thinking and reaction is done very simplistically based on code that's in our brains.
Yep.
And then last year or a couple of years ago, I read Sapiens, about where that code comes from. The combination of Thinking Fast and Slow about how our brains work and Sapiens on what's in our brains has made me very pessimistic and depressed about human nature and our ability to outgrow things like war. You ever thought about that?
Yes, it's an interesting discussion, I think, an interesting debate, and of course a very important one. It's not just academic interest, it's of actual interest to what happens in the here and now. I think cultural factors are important, so that we may have inherited certain traits and dispositions as a result of evolution, but those are controlled and mediated by our cultures and by our institutions, whether those are political, social, or church and religious institutions. And so just because we might have certain tendencies doesn't mean that as a group we might act on those tendencies. And there is an argument, there's a very interesting argument, in fact, that war is calculating and purposive, and therefore isn't drawing on the irrational, impulsive side of us. And there's a very interesting book, which you may want to read, and you've obviously read widely in this, and I don't believe you at all that you haven't read much. But there's a very interesting book by a man called Wrangham, who's written something called The Goodness Paradox. And what he's arguing is that in effect, through evolution and through centuries and millennia of development, we have probably bred out of ourselves some of our more aggressive impulses. that rather like, rather like wolves through breeding have been turned into dogs, often very cozy little nice dogs without the wolf-like tendencies, that we have somehow done this to ourselves, that those who are very aggressive have tended to get themselves killed before they can reproduce. And quite often women don't want to marry men or reproduce with men who are very aggressive. Now, it's an interesting argument, and I think he may be onto something. But what he argues is the paradox for him is that as we may have become individually less violent and perhaps nicer, like the nice dogs who've evolved from wolves, we've become better at fighting. We've become better at coldly applying violence, cold purposive violence, and that's the paradox for him. It's a fascinating book. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but again, it's one of those books like *Sapiens* that makes you think about us.
Sounds like it might be a bit of an antidote to *Sapiens*, so I'm going to seek it out immediately. That would help.
You'd enjoy it, I think.
People often talk about how economic conflict has taken over from military conflict. And that we're not going to have military wars anymore, but these battles are fought economically. Does that ring true to you?
Unfortunately not. Before the First World War, there was a lot of economic competition. And indeed, there was a lot of trade among countries. I mean, that was the other great globalized age before the present one. And a lot of people before 1914 were arguing that it would be no point having a military type of war because you could compete economically. As one German businessman said, there's no need for us to go to war. We'll be dominating the center of Europe anyway through our economy. And of course, he was right, except it took another few generations to get there. And, the other argument was that we're all so closely intertwined economically, it would make no sense to go to war. But they kept on preparing for war. And there was an arms race, even as people were saying this, it was an arms race before 1914. The armies were getting bigger and more weapons were coming along. I think we've got very much the same situation now. Yes, it probably wouldn't make sense to have a military type of war. In fact, it would be catastrophic given the nature of the weapons today. But that isn't stopping certain countries from making all sorts of military preparations. And the danger of that, you make the preparations, you spend a lot on the weapons, you spend a lot on your armed forces, you train them, and you make plans. And the danger is that...
Momentum.
Sorry?
Momentum,
yeah. And you get yourself into a situation where war becomes more likely. Not possible, not necessary, but likely.
Right. So do you consider it conceivable that we would have another world war, another major international conflict like that?
I can't rule it out completely, and I wish I could. But when you have two very large powers, the United States and China, with very big military establishments, with increased spending, both are increasing their spending, investing in new types of weapons. And of course, who are they doing it for? They're doing it for the other. They are looking at each other. They're also looking at other parts of the world, but increasingly they're looking at each other. And they are making the plans in Beijing and they're making the plans in Washington, not to say we're going to go to war, but just in case there is a war, what should we do? Which of course they have to do. So I don't think you can rule it out completely. And having said that, I mean, we may not, with good luck, we may not get a superpower war, but there are an awful lot of wars going on in the world at the moment, and they show no signs of stopping.
Does the decline of the U.S. in relative terms to the rest of the world, along with the seeming desire in the United States to withdraw from global leadership and pay more attention to their own affairs, does that make the world a safer place or a less safe place?
You could argue that it makes the world a safer place because the United States has engaged in a number of military ventures around the world which have not ended well. Afghanistan is still going on. That country is, I think, essentially a failed state. And yet again, there was a hideous bombing on the weekend, which is always, as so often, the civilians suffer. The conflict in Iraq goes on a low level. Conflict in Somalia is going on. Conflict in Libya is going on. So no, I don't think the United States has necessarily made the world a safer place, but we have to ask what will happen if the United States turns inwards. And as Canadians, we have to ask it because we are incapable of defending our very large landmass. And as the Arctic opens up and as the polar ice cap melts, we're going to be more and more under pressure from the Russians and from the Chinese, who are already very active. And how are we going to maintain that? How are we going to surveil that? How are we going to protect ourselves? And so for Canadians, the United States turning inward may look like a good thing for the world as a whole, but it may not be a good thing for us.
Right. Right. So that's an interesting segue. What is the potential for climate-related conflict around the world? As climate change has its effect in the coming decades, and I mean, what I understand about it is that it's going to dramatically change what areas of the planet are livable and which areas are not. And I presume there's going to be mass movements of people. And I've always assumed that has to include Canada. So, but it does feel to me, as you've got people desperately needing water and land, etc., that you've got the perfect conditions for war.
Well, I think climate change is a huge factor. And I think on the one hand, we're going to see more movements of people, which may lead to low-level conflict, particularly if those people come as an organized group, as, for example, the Mongols used to come in organized groups, or the Manchu used to come in organized groups across the center of Asia. But I think a lot of the movement of peoples will be just individual groups, families moving, and that may lead to a low level of conflict, but not war. War I tend to think of as something on a larger scale, but I think where it's really going to play out is in water. We're already seeing potential flashpoints. Egypt and Sudan at the moment are in dispute with Ethiopia, which is building a big dam on the Nile. And of course, without the Nile, the Sudan and Egypt can't function. I mean, they get, I forget what percent, over 90% of their water comes from the Nile. And so Ethiopia, by building dams, is threatening that. And that seems to me very likely to produce grounds for war. And China is damming and interrupting the rivers that flow out to its neighbors, whether down from the Himalayas or into Indochina. And that, again, I think is going to lead to potential, at least, for conflict. Although China is so big and so powerful, its neighbors may not want to take it on. But no, I think climate change is going to provide the grounds for future wars in a number of ways.
Okay. My last hotspot question is, do you think, and you spend a particular part of your book on civil wars and the difference between civil wars, is it incredibly alarmist to look at the United States and think that they might be creating the preconditions for a civil war in their country?
I don't think it's incredibly alarmist. I think it may still be at the alarmist stage, but I don't think we can rule out the possibility. You look at what's led to civil wars in other countries, and some of the same factors are there in the United States. People dividing themselves up into mutually antagonistic groups, and increasingly, apparently, even living in separate areas. You get Republican and Democratic suburbs now, or city centers will be more Democratic and Republicans will be more, the suburbs will be more Republican. So I think there is a danger in actual physical separation where people are no longer talking to each other. What I also find very worrying is the appearance of militia. There already is an absurd number of weapons in the United States. I think more than enough for every man, woman, and child, and people keep on buying and stockpiling them. And more worrying, I think, still, is that you get these people appearing in sort of facsimiles of military uniform and attempting to march or move in military formation, often driving military-style jeeps. And this, I think, is very worrying. I mean, we've seen that happen in other countries, and it's not a good sign. And what I also find...
It looks silly at the beginning, if I could just interrupt you. It looks silly at the beginning, but Hitler looked silly at the beginning, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I looked at some of these militia and I thought, I bet they couldn't walk 2 yards without falling over. I mean, a lot of them are not in the greatest shape, I would say. But they swagger around and carry these guns. I mean, not just, little pistols. They're carrying AK-47s or the equivalent. No, I do find this very worrying indeed. And the fact that you've got people in certain segments in the police, for example, you have a lot of former military people. And what will that do? Will they change their attitudes, or will they see everything as a military problem? And I find the rhetoric worrying. When you describe fellow citizens as scum, lice, whatever you describe them as, this is not good. This tears at the social fabric, I think.
Right. Did you find Trump scary in that regard? Did you think he was stoking those things?
Oh, I think he certainly was stoking them. I mean, Trump is, I think, without any sense of responsibility, except perhaps to himself and his nearest and dearest. But I think, no, he would use whatever rhetorical tool came to him. And he's also tweeting and retweeting some absolutely absurd and dangerous things. Any president who would retweet some of the stuff he's retweeted, it's extraordinary. He's not thinking of the United States.
Is there an historical figure that's comparable to him in terms of somebody that led a country that was like him?
The two comparisons that come to mind, not Hitler, I think, because Hitler had a much more coherent vision and actually had a more formidable party structure and militia. He reminds me a bit of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser before the First World War, who was incredibly vain, incredibly self-centered, liked to be the center of attention, liked everyone to be paying attention to him. But in the case of Kaiser Wilhelm, he was kept under control by his government much better than people around Trump have kept him under control. And the other one is Mussolini. Although Mussolini, I would say, was probably much more intelligent and had a clearer program about what he wanted to do. But Mussolini also loved the grand gesture, and he had this sort of hyper masculinity, look at me, I'm this great macho thing. And that, I think, is very similar to Trump. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even putting the chin forward. If people have shown photographs of Mussolini and Trump, and they both put their chins forward to look like leaders, and they sort of open their chest up. It is funny, but it's also rather alarming, I think.
It is. I've learned to take Mussolini not seriously, but I wasn't around in 1937. So, if there are more major global conflicts, one of the things you talk about in the book, I'm interested in how they might be different, because one of the things you talk about in the book is the declining appetite for casualties of war and for human losses from war. And when I watched the reaction to Canadians to the losses we suffered in the Afghanistan war, I thought, how would we ever be in a real war? Because people were angry about losses that in total for the whole war really add up to a bad day in the Second World War.
Yeah. I think, and that says something nice about our societies. We're less willing, I think, to tolerate the mass slaughter of our young people. The losses of the First World War were absolutely horrific, and I don't think any European country would ever be able to tolerate those again. In fact, they were very unwilling to tolerate them in the Second World War, which helps to explain some of their policies. But what we have got, I think, increasingly is something in some ways rather like the 18th century, where states had very small professional armies, highly trained people who were in the armies for long times, not conscript armies. And that, it seems to me, is what we've got. And of course, we now have weapons that can substitute for boots on the ground in some cases, and substitute for the mass armies of the two world wars. So we have very high technology weapons that can do sorts of things, self-guided weapons, weapons guided by artificial intelligence, which don't need a human being there. I mean, they're talking now of, I think the next generation of fighter planes won't have pilots. And they're talking now of ships without crews. So things are changing. So we may not be facing the same level of casualties, but what we need to remember is when a war starts, it's not just the soldiers who get killed, and the civilians will be killed in a war on a large scale as they are being killed at the moment. And this is something I think we really need to remember.
Yeah, it's a bigger part of war now than that's a big emphasis on your book, is the targeting of civilian populations.
Yeah.
In recent times. But do you consider the drone campaign that the United States carries on to be an act of war? It's part of their war on terror, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I've always had problems with the war on terror because a war is against an enemy. Terror is a noun. It's not an enemy. And usually in a war, when you start a war, you have some definition of what victory will be. You defeat the enemy. How do you defeat terror? I mean, terror is diffuse. It comes from everywhere. There are always new terrorists appearing, often self-recruited. I think it was a mistaken formulation because there is no clear ending to it. And that's what I think is a worry. But the United States, I think the American government is, I may be wrong, but I think the American government is storing up trouble for itself by using drones to assassinate political leaders that it doesn't like, or military leaders it doesn't like, because if it does it to others, others will feel free to do it to the United States. And the drone technology is getting cheaper, it's getting more effective. It's quite possible to imagine people smuggling drones into populated areas of somewhere like the United States and using them against targets. And so I think by using drones, the United States had a temporary advantage, but I think it's going to lose that advantage. And I think it's stored up a bit of trouble for itself.
Yeah, because that's much more difficult to control and more random and more actually something the terrorists could use quite easily.
Yeah, yeah. And as we know more and more, I mean, it used to be thought that terrorists came from elsewhere. And what we're finding more and more is that terrorists recruit themselves on the internet, often from people who've lived in a society, been born in a society, but they get on the internet and they find someone who persuades them they should commit an act of terror. And I think the homegrown terrorism is one that we're going to have to worry about increasingly.
One of the things I was thinking about when I was reading was the nature of people's desire for battle, and how much you talked about how people often in centuries past were enthusiastic about going into battle, looked forward to going into battle, wanted the excitement and the drama of war in their lives. And I think to our society now, is it not the case that we have too much to lose? Like those people were in desperate circumstances. That's why war looked attractive. Their lives were horrible. Our lives aren't horrible.
But it's not just misery and poverty and desperation that drives people to war. You think of the upper classes in European society who down through history were bred to war. They were brought up to be brave. They were brought up to accept physical damage. They're brought up to accept the possibility of dying. And they went to war. They went to war willingly, thinking that war was a glorious thing. It was a test of them. And I think in our society, we have people who find there is something in the excitement of war, the exhilaration of war, the knowing that you might die. I mean, it's not that different, I think, from people who jump off ski jumps or hurtle down mountains at great speeds or ride on motorcycles at great speed. There's always that element of fear. I once was talking to a Canadian general who I was interviewing for something, and after we'd finished the interview, he said, no soldier will ever admit it to you. He said, and I won't say it on record, but he said, there is an edge. He said, it is like riding a fast motorcycle. There's an edge that that you're flirting with death, and it gives an intensity to the experience. So, it's very uncomfortable to think about, but I think we have to recognize that for certain people, war is an exhilaration, and the prospect of their own deaths is not something that's going to deter them. You think of that, what I thought was a very good movie, The Hurt Locker, about the bomb disposal guy, who went back because he couldn't stand peacetime life in the United States.
Right. Death doesn't scare me as much as wounding does. Don't wound me. Yeah. I don't want to be wounded on the battlefield.
Yeah. I think a lot of soldiers and those who fight feel that. And, it's one of the things that, again, we find very uncomfortable. But, there have been incidents where people who've been badly wounded have asked to be put out of their misery, and armed forces have done it. And then, of course, they can get into real trouble for doing it. But you can understand why they would do it. I mean, they would see themselves as doing a favor to someone who is very badly wounded. And, you would often get people carrying guns so that they could kill themselves rather than be taken prisoner. That's not the same as fear of being wounded, but fear of being taken prisoner and treated badly is also a big fear, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think a democracy can beat a totalitarian regime in a war? We
have done. Democracies have beaten totalitarian regimes. We beat Germany's.
But in 2020.
Well, democracies have a great deal of inherent power. It'll take us a while to get going. We have to be convinced that the war, as citizens of democracies, we have to be convinced that the war is the right one. But I think we have a capacity in those circumstances to carry war on. And I think often democracies are more efficient than totalitarian regimes. I mean, I think there's a myth that the totalitarian regime is terribly efficient because it just tells everyone what to do. It makes mistakes. I mean, Hitler's Germany made all sorts of mistakes, wasted material, killed people it should have kept around, drove out its own nuclear physicists. Democracies in their messy way can often be extremely effective in war. Again, it depends on people supporting the war, and it depends on the sort of government you have. But no, I think democracies can certainly defeat totalitarian regimes.
Do we have the stomach for that kind of thing? Look at COVID. What is our reaction to COVID and the extremely modest deprivations that we've been asked to endure for 6 months during this period of COVID? What does that tell you about our capacity to withstand a war that has ebbs and flows, that has 2 bad years where you're losing? And casualties are happening, and Dieppe happens. And how does a democratic government survive that now?
Well, COVID is like war. You don't have much choice, do you? We can't just say, go away, COVID, stop at our borders. The virus doesn't stop at borders. And it's the same thing with war. You don't always have a choice whether your country goes to war. And if it's a choice between annihilation or fighting on, you will do it. And people have often said about wars that there is a sort of comradeship and a sort of enduring it together, which will keep people going. I mean, I just finished an extraordinary book on the siege of Moscow in 1941, how they kept going, goodness knows, but they did. And they remained in amazingly good spirits, a lot of them. I mean, there was a sort of shared misery. And I don't think publics have done all that badly with COVID. I mean, the media point to the people who go to the raves and they go to the big weddings and stuff. But I think most of us have accepted the restrictions on our movements and would probably accept more. Certainly in Canada, I mean, I'm struck by how virtually everyone you see on the street has a mask to hand. They're either, about to put it on or they have it on. And inside where you have to wear masks, I think I've only seen one person so far without a mask out of a very large number of people who are wearing them. So, I think, again, we never know until we're tested. But I think our response as publics has been pretty good. I mean, governments haven't always been that efficient, but I think we are prepared to take restrictions on our freedom in a way that really would have surprised me 7 months ago, 8 months ago.
Right. One of the things that I guess I first learned when I read Stalingrad 1942 and Berlin 1945 by, who's the author that wrote those books?
Anthony Beevor.
Right, Anthony Beevor. They're riveting books. And you talk about this in your book, about how often the worst things that soldiers do in war, they do after they've won.
Yeah.
They do on their way through victory. What does that tell us that we've done to those people by the time that they get there? And what kind of people are they when they come back home? If they are prepared, once the actual hostilities are over and you've won, to now commit the greatest atrocities. Let's just say raping women. Let's just say you're going through town and you're raping women, and then the next day you're back in you're back in Belleville.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of what have we done to the people?
Well, as one American mother said of a son who was caught up in an atrocity in Vietnam at My Lai, she said, "I sent the army a good boy and they sent me back a killer." And those words stay with me. I think for soldiers who've come through very difficult times, I think there is a relaxing of discipline sometimes, and sometimes it's the fault of their officers. I mean, Stalin said of the Russian soldiers as they raped and looted their way across Europe, he said, "Why shouldn't they have a bit of fun? They've suffered enough." Well, when you get that sort of message coming down from the top, discipline will get relaxed, and sometimes officers are reluctant to intervene. And you get soldiers who think we're owed this. We have survived. We are the winners. We've come through all the odds. It's our turn. And these people have put us through it. And so what if we treat them in appalling ways? It's always difficult for armies because sometimes, in fact, they encourage this sort of behavior and used to get towns sacked in the Middle Ages where the officers just said, "Go ahead, it's yours to do what you want with." But it is always a problem for armies, even the best ones, because they are training their men, it's usually men, to become calculating killers. But they have to keep that in check because when they run out of order, when they run out of that check, they can do absolutely appalling things. And we know even Canadian soldiers have been known to shoot prisoners of war after they've been captured. We know that even Canadians, nice Canadians, can commit the sorts of atrocities that happen in war. But it is, no, I think it's a real problem for the military.
Our guest last week was involved in mental health, and we had a long discussion about mental illness and mental health in our society. So, the biggest trope about this is the person that comes back from the war, the guy that comes back from war, and never talks about it to his family or to his friends or anything, never says a word about the war, just goes on with life stoically. We tell these stories approvingly of these quiet, solid men that bore this burden themselves and never talked about it to anybody. Knowing what we know now about mental health, what was going on with those men?
Well, I think there's still a debate. I may be wrong, and your guest last week could correct me, but I think there's still a debate about whether it is better to sort of let it all out and explore it, perhaps with deep analysis, whether it's better to repress unpleasant memories, at least for a time. And I don't know if we've decided which is better. For some, it may depend on the individual. Some people just want to get on with life and don't want to dwell on the past, and I can see that. But there may be those who feel such a burden that the only way they can deal with it is to do a talking therapy and is to talk perhaps to others who have gone through the same things. But I'm not sure that there's a one-size prescription for everyone who comes back from war or anyone who has suffered a trauma. There are some people who seem to be bowed down by trauma, understandably, and others who don't let it, don't let it is the wrong word, but others who seem to be able to carry that burden without it crippling them. So very difficult to tell. I mean, I think what has improved a lot is that the military have taken the mental health of their people much more seriously. You got these things in the First World War where men were accused of cowardice when they had basically completely broken down in the appalling conditions of the trenches and under shell fire. And I think the military and society in general now understand much more about mental health. And so perhaps people are more willing to speak about it, and we're more willing, that people who've suffered such trauma are more willing to seek treatment, and the military and society at large are more willing to give that treatment and more willing to understand. So I'm not sure there's any right way to treat someone who's had a terrible trauma. I think we're still trying to learn how to do it. And there may be different ways of treating different traumas in different people. I don't know enough about it, but it seems to me we're still at a stage where we don't have definitive answers to all of this.
Have you seen the documentary on Robert McNamara called Fog of War?
Ages ago, yeah.
Right. So one of the lessons that he took from his experience in war, actually partly Vietnam, but more from the Second World War, where he was involved with Curtis LeMay in the firebombing of Japanese cities. And he talked with great remorse about the casualties, about how they literally burnt, well before the nuclear weapons hit Japan, that they had burned to the ground major cities across Japan. And he uses this to raise the point of proportionality in war. Yeah. And you spend a lot of time in the book trying to explore rules of war and where they come from and why there ought to be rules in war and how sustainable they are. Yeah. But when you're in a war, with the stakes of a war, where does proportionality of your responses come in? And how do you factor that? How does that mentality wind its way into war?
Well, proportionality should come in. I mean, what you should be thinking of is, why am I in this war, and what do I want out of it, and what is victory? What will be the point at which I say, okay, I've won? And so if I bring my enemy to the point where the enemy says I'd like to surrender, then there's no point in my continuing to destroy everything about the enemy, civilians, infrastructure, anything, because I've already won. And I think proportionality, I mean, again, it's part of the long discussion of what makes a just war. But those who have written about it and thought about it over the centuries say that you should exercise as much as you can proportionality, that once you have achieved your goal, you should not go on exerting violence and destroying the other side, because that becomes a crime. You don't need to do it, and that you should use what is proportional. McNamara was haunted for the rest of his life, I think, by the failure in Vietnam, but also by his part in the Second World War. And the mass bombing you're quite right. I mean, the firebombing of Tokyo at the beginning of 1945 was devastating. I mean, as devastating in its own way as the atomic bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki was. And the bombing of German cities was absolutely devastating. And there still is an argument, and it still goes on, about whether it was absolutely necessary to do that, whether the enemy, in this case Germany or Japan, could have been brought to surrender without killing huge numbers of civilians.
But proportionality will always be in the eye of the beholder, right? There probably weren't many people outside of the United States who thought that the U.S. response to 9/11 was proportionate. But Americans did.
Yes. And I think perhaps what they lost sight of, and we were talking earlier about the war on terror, is who was their enemy and what did they want to happen to that enemy? What was the goal of the wars that they were about to wage? And I think in Afghanistan, it was pretty clear. They wanted to get rid of the Taliban because the Taliban had protected Osama bin Laden, who had done the World Trade Center and the other atrocities in the United States. And if they had stopped there, I think world opinion, and I certainly would have said that was proportional. They got rid of a regime which was an outlaw regime, which was supporting someone who carried out this act of aggression, an act of war on American soil, on American people. And if they had replaced the government, and if they had then used their considerable resources and influence with their allies to build an Afghanistan that worked and to try and build a workable government, I think a lot of people had said that's a proportional response. But going into Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein, particularly when there was no evidence that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with the World Trade Tower bombings and the other attacks on the Pentagon and elsewhere in the United States, that was not proportional. That was not serving the end of justice for the American people. And I think we've seen what it's led to. It led to the destruction, not just of a dreadful regime, but terrible price for the people of Iraq.
And a tremendous loss of prestige and influence and treasure for the United States of America.
Absolutely. No, I agree.
I guess, we're out of time. I could talk to you all afternoon, but you can't talk to me all afternoon. So my last question for you will be about international institutions and whether we have the ones in place that we need, or what kind of institutions we might need to try to forestall the world we're envisioning and try to create a Star Trek world where all the peoples of the earth are united and harmonious, and we're all searching throughout the galaxy to spread our message of love and togetherness to other planets. That's two visions of the future.
Yeah.
Where is the, I'm pretty jaundiced about the United Nations. What do we have that can pull us all together?
Well, I think what we have is shared challenges, and that's one way of pulling people together. We're facing climate change, and I don't think we're even beginning to grasp, a lot of us, what that's going to mean. And that is something that even in fortunate countries like Canada is going to bite and going to affect us. So that's a global problem. And if we don't have global responses, we are going to be in even more trouble than we're in already. And we have other global issues. We will have other pandemics. And we know that's going to happen. And that's a global issue. We have a global economic network. And that's another thing that we have to worry about. And so, yes, we have global challenges which should make us work together. And we can get disillusioned with the United Nations, but if we didn't have it, we'd probably try and come up with something similar that brings the nations of the world together. And I think what we need to remember always is why it was set up in the first place. It was set up as a result of what went wrong in the 30s. It was set up as a result of the Second World War, and it was an attempt to try and make war something of the past. Now, it hasn't succeeded, but it can only be as good as its members. And so I think there's responsibility that every country has to try and make it a stronger organization. But I wouldn't get rid of what we have internationally. I would try and strengthen it. I'd try and amend it. I'd try and add to it. We probably need a stronger World Health Organization, more independent from government pressure. And there are lots of things we need. We need to look at how to control the internet. We need to look at how to control disinformation and the negative uses of the internet. And I think that's going to take international cooperation. I think we'll never probably have a sort of galaxy where we all live in harmony with each other and have an outside mission. But I think we can go a long way to building up our international organizations. And I think we should always ask ourselves, what are the alternatives? And the alternatives are pretty bleak if we don't have international cooperation.
You know, one of the advantages of the Star Trek future is that there's a uniform. And so you don't have to worry about your clothes every day. There's just one uniform that everybody wears. And that's, something about the future that could be quite time-saving for us. But do you see, dating back to your book, Paris 1919, and your understanding of these coalitions, do you see any realpolitik way that we can reform the Security Council of the United Nations?
Well, we shouldn't we? It's absolutely absurd that it reflects the power structure at the end of the Second World War. Britain and France should not have separate membership. There should be a European membership. And even if the British are out of the European Union, there should be a single European membership. India should probably be in. There should probably be an African country in and a Latin American country in. But reforming it, of course, the countries that are there will cling on by their fingernails because it gives them prestige. And it's a huge task, but I think it's got to be done. I think the Security Council has got to reflect the existing power structure of the world, not something half a century or more ago.
Great. Ms. MacMillan, it is such a joy to talk to somebody as intelligent and informed as you are. I thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's been a real pleasure for me, and I know it will have been for my listeners as well. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I wish I should have said at the beginning, please call me Margaret, but it's too late now. But may I thank you as well?
That would have been a bit intimidating.
Oh, well.
All right.
Lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you. So here's the thing about trains. Because of momentum and the laws of physics, they consume way less fuel than trucks. And in the last several years, railroad companies have used technology to make trains awfully long. Some are more than 4 kilometers. That's nearly 2.5 miles for those of us who still think that way. A modern train can take hundreds of trucks off the road, which is sort of a big deal these days. But here's another thing about trains. They have to be unloaded. Their cargo, automobiles, grain, household consumer goods, whatever, has to travel the last mile by truck. That's just reality. Unloading requires a terminal where containers can be transferred from trains to trucks for local delivery. Without a transfer terminal, the whole system chokes up. And the area around Toronto needs a new terminal. It's the fastest growing market in the country. Its appetite for cargo is voracious. At the moment, though, CN trains have to stop in Montreal, and cargo is continuing down the 401 by truck. Thousands and thousands of trucks. It should be going by train. So our sponsor, CN, has for the past 5 years been trying to open a new transfer terminal in Milton, southwest of the GTA. An environmental assessment had to be done. CN did the work. There were thousands of consultations with environmentalists, local governments, and Indigenous groups. Accommodations were made. And ultimately, the government's assessment panel decided that there is indeed a compelling case for the new terminal. CN has worked with the local communities. It sold them land, invested millions, and guaranteed wetland and habitat enhancements. It's been a long 5 years, but CN understood the need for all the hurdles and hoops. Final approval is now up to Cabinet. The job is shovel-ready, it will create jobs, and it'll unclog an artery in the Canadian economy. Proper regulation does not mean inertia. It's time to start work. All right, here we are. It's Tuesday, and the panel is back. Jenni, Scott, great to see you.
Oh, sure.
How are you
Act
doing?
like that.
Yeah.
I sent you your $1,000, you larcenous son of a bitch. I hope you're happy. Shame me into it.
Really?
For Juno. What was I supposed to do? People don't know, but in the setup to this call, both of you spent 10 minutes telling me that, yes, in fact, I would be a welcher if I did not send you $1,000 for fucking Juno and the Juno Awards. And what was his name? Andre Juno, head of the series.
Pierre.
So there you go.
Pierre.
Well, Pierre. So piss on Pierre Juno then, and he just cost me $1,000.
You were very adamant. You were very adamant that he was not who the Junos were named after.
even though
It was a perfect duel because I was certain I was right, and you were apparently certain that you were right. You reacted with certainty.
because it's even though it's been documented that I'm incorrect, that I'm 1,000% incorrect. The fact that it's spelled not in his name, I think, is a big asterisk. I think it's worth $1,000 actually, that asterisk. And it pisses me off. It's named after, like, if there was something that was named after Reid, I would expect it to be spelled R-E-I-D, not B-W-C-H. Like, come on, it's ridiculous.
Should be spelled lizard if it's named after you.
The lizard. The lizard may come out.
Jenni, I got a question
for listeners.
Really
the lizard, just for listeners, David. The lizard is what Herle calls me when I switch from beer to liquor right around 10:30 at night. When the lizard comes out, my eyes get thin, and my tongue gets slithery, and my jokes become cold-blooded.
Jenni, I got a life question for you I need some help with. How can a person be 58 years old and have all of this shit that goes along with being 58 years old and still get pimples on their face? Like, what is the fucking fairness of that in life? How does that work?
Is that because you're wearing a mask? Because I've read articles now that people are breaking out in their
more anti-masker.
No, I'm not anti-masker. I'm just saying people are breaking out because they're wearing a mask, and so around their nose and their mouth,
Really?
people of your vintage, David, are breaking out in pimples.
So there it is. It's yet another COVID factor.
Spider-Man is a disaster. You take that thing off, he's just a sea of acne.
Hey, Reid, Joe Biden has... What?
Go ahead.
Just saying, Joe Biden has an all-female comms team. Yes. You're going out of business. You're the way of the dinosaur, Scott.
Well, this is not news that I'm gazing at the sky and looking at the fireball and thinking, well, I think that missed me. But yeah, I think it's a cool thing. It's not, a bunch of people have pointed out in Canadian jurisdictions, provincial and federal, it's not unprecedented. I think it happened under Chrétien. Did it happen under Harper? Whole comms team, except for me, was actually female, and our PMO not for all of it, but for part of it.
It's a terrible thing to say about Feschuk.
Well, I meant like press secretaries, that sort of stuff. I didn't mean Feschuk. Feschuk, who sat in the... Jenni, do you remember the PMO? Do you remember that office that was in behind the men's bathroom? There was
yes.
That's where
that was our policy shop, not our comm shop. But yes, I do remember.
Wasn't a comm shop for us either. I just assigned that office to Feschuk, so he would sit in there. And he finally just, without asking anybody, without coordinating with operations or the people in charge of the building, he just moved. He just moved his office. He was so sick of listening to the toilet flush, he got pissed off, and he's held that against me forever. I thought it was a perfect spot for him.
Okay, so yesterday, economic statement by the finance minister. Big deal. Lots of hype around it. Long awaited. Pretty meaty document. Still not a budget. And given the metaphors that were at use in the speech, there could be a lot of things that aren't budgets yet. They've got a lot of terms they could use up now. That first one was a snapshot. This one was a statement. There could yet be an update.
Well, we're going to have, instead of an anchor, we're going to have
guardrails.
Guardrails. We're going to have guardrails. No anchor, guardrails.
Guardrails. And then there was a section of the speech, like about a paragraph, that I thought was written by Chauncey Gardner, because it talked about planting flowers and seed sprouting and
large rhetorical kind of departure from the rest of the speech's tone. It's just all of a sudden, boom! Somebody Irish grabbed the pen for like 20 minutes, and you're like, what happened there?
Very funny. Anyway, there's a huge amount of stuff in it to talk about. It's got a massive amount of spending. It's got a massive deficit. as we expected. It's got huge ongoing commitments to support the economy through COVID. And it's got, I could be wrong about this because it's only the morning after, but it seems to me there's $100 billion set aside notionally to spend on recovery once the government decides we're out of COVID management situation and into recovery situation. They've allocated an unspecified spending of $100 billion. Anyway, lots to chew on in that thing. Jenni, what's your overall take?
Well, it's to your point there. It's they've talked about another $100 billion worth of spending. We're at close to a $400 billion deficit, 83 billion, as well as well over a $1 trillion net debt. So we're spending more than most than every other G7 country, and have the highest unemployment rate other than Italy. So I'm not really sure what it's getting us, but this is kind of the for discussion is to your point, David. You said that they put aside $100 billion for spending once we're out of COVID. Well, what does that mean? And I know we're going to get into vaccines and stuff afterwards, but what does out of COVID now mean? And it's a genuine question for the government. What does that mean? So when does the taps flow on this $100 billion on top of everything else we're spending in terms of recovery?
Well, you'd have to assume we're going to get some more specificity on that before an election, Jenni, wouldn't you?
Oh, do they want?
They're not going to go through an election without telling us how they're.
I think the less specifics, the better, is what this government wants. And so I think that we are more apt to go into an election without specifics than we are getting them.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Really? Scott, what was your take on yesterday's performance? Yeah.
So you go ahead, Scott, and I'll give my thoughts.
No, Jenni, go.
Yeah, keep going.
No, go, Scott, because mine is actually more going into the vaccine conversation. So.
Oh, Jesus. All right.
So I had all those same questions. You know, what's $100 billion? They've tucked in some green recovery stuff without placing emphasis on it. I think there's an alternative universe in which the second wave didn't grip the country quite so heavily. And this was a very different speech. This was a speech about recovery, and this was a blueprint for how the country would be remade and so forth. And I think we got a lot of that spending tucked into the fiscal framework, but we didn't get the elaboration and the language and the rhetoric of it. I think for good reason. I think it would have been politically extraordinarily incautious to have gone forward and said, all right, let's look past the status quo. Let's look past the contemporary moment that's gripping the country as we walk into Christmas and half the nation is in lockdown and the other half soon probably will be, and talk about what we're going to do in terms of recovery and how we want to remake ourselves. I think it was wise to avoid that. You know, increasingly, and, you know, we're joking about how old we were earlier, David, you know, as I get older and nuance seems to be trampled more and more in virtually in political communication, in issues management, I think I increasingly am coming to the view that, you know, you can never afford to get the small things wrong, right? Because the small things can bite you in the ass and be big things. So that's true in politics, like the Bev Oda orange juice kind of thing, right? Can take off on you. And there's lots of other examples from every political party and every government. But you got to get the big things right. And I think what happened yesterday is, you know, it felt to me like the government had to make an adjustment about 10 days ago and say, you know, we can't do what we're going to do. We can't talk the way we're going to talk as the GTA goes into lockdown, as Saskatchewan and Manitoba go into lockdown, as BC and large portions of Alberta go into lockdown. We've got to change course. And I think they got the big thing right. I think they got back to where they were in March, where they basically said, we're going to spend, we're going to extend the wage subsidy, we're going to enrich the wage subsidy, we're going to enrich the rent relief program. But basically, a lot of that nuance is lost. What we heard yesterday was, we're not through this. We will get through it, and then we're going to have a plan, and we'll talk about what that is. But right now, we're going to spend. We're not going to apologize about it. We're not going to get into an argument about the size of the deficit. We're not going to get into an argument about, programmatic niceties. We're not going to get into an argument right now about transfers to the provinces. We'll have that discussion on the 10th of December. Our message, our big thing message is, we're here for you. We're going to back you up. And I think that's probably the right play. I think it's probably the right policy play. Like, I was glad to see the wage subsidy extended. And I think it's the right political message. Like, I think they got the big thing right. There's an enormous number of questions left. No doubt. Like, enormous. Like, what's $100 billion? What kind of accountability mechanisms are we going to get on all that? How's that stuff going to get rolled out? And I presume that's going to come. But yesterday, if their big message was, holy shit, man, we're back into it, and we're going to spend to help keep people afloat and keep businesses afloat, I think they got the big thing right.
Well, let's start with, from my perspective, and it's tempting to look only for the new thing. I'm going to basically reinforce what you were saying. It's tempting to look for the new thing and be disappointed that there isn't a brand new thing to be excited about. This is me, Jenni. When you like government action and you like government programs, I get excited about a new thing, and so the fact that there wasn't a new thing, but the mammoth commitment that they have made, and when I say mammoth, I think everybody would agree it's larger than what almost every country in the world has done, massively larger than what the United States has done. In terms of supporting the economy, supporting people, the amount of money that they are pumping in to the economy is the biggest thing. And it has kept this country afloat, and to the point where, unless you're unemployed, most people probably don't even know that there's a recession going on in the country. And the reality is we've had a massive economic contraction that would have normally been absolutely devastating for families across. So they did get the big thing right, and they continue to get the big thing right. And I noticed that nobody in opposition is taking issue with any of those structural support programs. The Conservatives dance carefully around their deficit critiques because they don't want to be seen to be on the wrong side of, for instance, CERB or the wage subsidy. In fact, their critique of the wage subsidy is it wasn't early enough. So I think there's a strong consensus around all these things, and they're the right things. My question about
because Canadians' income is household income has gone up 11% in the last year.
Yep.
Yeah.
So people are actually
many people are better off.
So people are essentially doing better because they're propped up by governments that won't be able to sustain this. And even Trudeau himself has basically signaled that over the last in the last 2 months, he has signaled we are not going to be able to continue down this road. And so an economic statement is a lot easier than giving a full out budget. So people are, and we've talked about this over the last 8 months, people are, it's kind of a false economy right now. So you have decisions being made by bureaucrats who have their full salary and get to work at home and don't actually understand what it's like for people that have to actually go out and work.
That's pretty unfair. That's a pretty unfair thing to say. Don't you think? Don't understand what it's like to go out and work. That's a pretty sharp thing to say.
Okay, but Scott, what do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't agree that people. I don't agree that just because people are in the public service, they'd have no appreciation for the hardship of others. I don't agree with that.
I don't think they fully see what the hardship of others is. I stand by that.
Okay.
So if you're getting a full salary and you get to stay at home and you get to work, it is easy to make decisions for other people that do not have the luxury that you do.
I think that ascribes a degree of malice and insensitivity. That's not necessarily fair.
I don't think it's malice at all. I just think it's the fact of the matter is you don't actually see what other people are, or you feel what other people are going through.
Right.
But so David, to your point is that this is a false economy right now. So even if we've now seen over the last couple of months that inflation on certain things like groceries, on produce, have started to go up. So if inflation goes up, what does that mean? It means interest rates are going to go up. So this false sense of security that the government keeps telling us that, don't worry, we'll assume the debt because we'll just print more money. That's not going to be an option anymore. And I think that the Liberals are getting that. And I think that's why they're doing an economic statement. And I think that's why we're going to see an election sooner rather than later. And I think that if Trudeau had one regret, I assume the regret would be not going in the fall, when around the time that John Horgan was going as well.
But of course it's a false economy. But I think that may be the great political achievement of the last number of months, is that the government committed early on, and I had lots of criticism of specific levers and mechanisms, but I think the government identified early on that it wanted to create a false economy, that it felt obligated to create a false economy because the alternative would be devastating for people. And so I think that was an achievement. I think it continues to be an achievement. I think that it's probably the right public policy. I think it's certainly the right public policy. And I'm pretty sure it's good politics. Now, of course, the deficit is going to grow as a consequence, but it's growing elsewhere. The United Kingdom is a train wreck when it comes to fiscal matters. And as for interest rates, I mean, the bank has said pretty clearly it ain't raising interest rates until 2023. So
they said 2022. They said 2022, and they said they would prefer not to. They haven't said they won't.
Right. And the inflation band is, we're still well below the inflation band. It's also winter, which is when groceries become more expensive always. And yeah, there's lots of perversities in the economy right now. But so I'm not actually disagreeing with much of what you said. I'm just saying that I think the false economy is an achievement. I think it's a political achievement. I think it's a public policy achievement. It is by definition not sustainable. But I think the government's also saying it's not sustainable. When does it become not sustainable? When we got this thing beat to the ground, and not until.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, the governor of the Bank of Canada was at the Finance Committee last week, and I thought he was pretty clear that they did not expect that 600,000 people who are unemployed as a result of COVID to disappear overnight. That was going to be a multi-year process of the economy recovering enough to put those people back to work. So these supports are probably going to have to be in place for a while. I thought it was interesting that the deficit forecasts show a declining deficit down to 4 or 5 years from now. And I know what a grain of salt to take deficit forecasts of 4 or 5 years from now. But their own projections show the deficit back to levels it was at before COVID hit. And so that implies to me that it is not within their contemplation to radically change fiscal policy because of the cost of borrowing, and they're not.
So if we're going to be down to deficit levels that we were pre-COVID, there is only going to be one of two decisions this government has to make. They either decrease spending or they increase taxes. There's no other way. There is absolutely no other way. So this government has to say then, okay, so if we are going to be in 5 years where we were last year at this time, how is that possible?
Well, I think
it'd be interesting to dig in. It'd be interesting to dig into the background documents and find out where they see that track declining. But you're right.
For sure, you're right. But I think the big question, which I don't know the answer to, and no one knows the answer to, but someone has the obligation to put forward a projection around, is how much of that aligns relatively quickly, once the structural relief programs are removed, right? So once those things that were, the false economy, the struts of the false economy, as we're terming it here, once those things are taken away, how much of that deficit just kind of melts right away, and how much lingers, and how long will you keep some of those things for longer? And so there's, getting back to where we were, just like that, even 3-4 years, that seems unlikely to me.
So we have talked on this about, you guys have brought up this she session before. So there are going to be certain sectors in hospitality, tourism, service, retail, where it never fully comes back. And so where are people going to get jobs? Where do the jobs, if I have lost my job working at a retail store, and retail is basically, here in Toronto, it's completely shut down. Yep. And there's more and more stores. my walk to work, I think I've said this, I have a 15-minute walk to work, and basically every week there is another store that's completely shut down, like storefront is gone. So where are people?
Well, the loss of Christmas is going to be fatal to retail. So many retailers, they can't survive not having Christmas.
But that's exactly the point I was trying to make there, Jenni, which is if the projections show that we return within 3-4 years to where we were before in terms of a deficit level, I think I just can't say with certainty, but I think that's unlikely because it isn't like you just withdraw the relief programs and you go, okay, well that costs X billions of dollars and now they're not going to be in place and boom, it's fixed. Because I think there are going to be lingering structural effects. I assume this thing is a decade-long fix, for the retail sector to return to health, hospitality. I assume you are going to have a lingering higher level of base unemployment, like a whole bunch of negative consequences that probably won't permit you to just go, all right, but the crisis is over, and now we can quit writing checks. Well,
that's presumably where the
That's
presumably where the $100 billion comes in. That's presumably where the $100 billion comes in. So here's my question, and liberals who are listening, don't think I'm an asshole because I do believe the government's fundamentally doing the right things on this, and I'm very supportive of the overall supports they put in place. So, don't come down on me too hard. But what was prorogation about?
Yeah.
And what was that whole period of time that was supposed to be putting in place a big rethink? And why does the recovery and the COVID management in all instances have to be phased the way it is being phased? So, for example, my understanding was that everybody agreed that women were being hit exceptionally hard, both financially and emotionally, by the recession, by the pandemic, and that childcare was an essential part of getting back to work, of getting women back to work and getting our economy back to full potential, and getting our kids back in better shape as well. Now, why can't that happen now? So they've got $20 million for a secretariat, and I know that the child care advocates asked for a secretariat, but presumably they wanted that secretariat to have something to do. And $400 million, which we know from our history with child care nationally, is a pittance of money. A pittance of money. So why aren't they moving aggressively now to expand affordable childcare for people and to create more spaces? Why does the green stuff have to wait? If you're going to do a retrofit program, why can't we start a retrofit program? So why are they holding all this stuff back? Is it because they haven't fully decided what they're going to do? Is it because they have inordinate respect for the Fed-Prov process and want to negotiate all this stuff out beforehand? Or is it that they want to announce this stuff later, closer to an election, and it's all going to be there?
Jenni, before you reply, can I take a very quick stab? Because I think I'm going to say what you will say, but less sweary. I think it's smart. Actually, that's not the part you're going to say. I think it's smart that they're not doing those things, David. And I think if you're a pure public policy advocate, you might say it's a shame. But I think it's smart because I think the story of where prorogation went was that prorogation was going to be about the Great Reset, as they called it at the WEF before it got turned by the far right into a label of abuse and threat and suspicion. And I think that's what prorogation was going to be. They were like, let's look past the pandemic and let's talk about the way in which we will re-engineer and we will build back better and all of that. And I think then they realized, holy shit, we're on fire. And then it came back this and it came back this fall.
Why didn't they say that in the speech from the throne, Scott? Why didn't they say that in the speech from the throne?
No. Sorry. What my point is that once they got on top of doing it, between the idea of proroguing and having that and the reality of COVID made it impossible to build castles in the sky. that rhetorically you would be so at odds with what people are feeling and going through. And I think the same thing happened here. This economic state was going to spell that stuff out in greater detail. And I think they realized that's going to seem really odd when people are going into lockdown. So they've just withdrawn all that stuff and they're punting to the spring. And I just think politically, if they'd gone out and talked about, we're going to implement a full childcare program, we're going to do this in terms of a giant green recovery, I think people would have said, hey, fuck, man, let's get the crisis at hand dealt with first. And then you can re-engineer Canada and society and social inequities. I think it's smart to pull back.
Or they realize that maybe people, that's actually not what people want. Like, you guys have been campaigning on a national daycare program for 25 years. Like in 2006, when we won, it was a national daycare program, which you guys promised for the 4 elections previous and never delivered on, versus money for parents. So maybe
we did deliver on it. We negotiated with every province and the territories an agreement, and it would have been early childhood learning.
Jenni, you won the election. You won the election. You don't have to revise history.
And it never happened. So at the end of the day, and so. At the end of the day, maybe it's just because they realize that this is not something they're willing. There is a lot of political fights that this government is going to have, and we're going to get into vaccine and other stuff over the next several minutes. And this government has to pick where they're going to end up doing their battle, where they're going to fight their fight.
Well, her rhetoric around childcare is so unequivocal. I mean, and that's what I found a bit jarring, was the gap between her rhetoric, what she was saying about the importance of childcare. My opinion is rhetoric, but yours is not.
Freeland's rhetoric.
No, I'm talking about Christia. I'm talking about Christia, that her rhetoric was so strong on childcare that it was the gap between what she was saying about the importance and urgency of childcare versus the seeming incrementalism of the action that I found a bit jarring. And the reality is childcare is not a big political winner. Jenni's instincts are right about this. I mean, I not only have the 2006 experience, I've got the Wynne government experience. And I remember telling the caucus and the cabinet that the only people who really care about childcare, who really think it's important, are women who need spaces right now. Not men at all, and not women who don't need childcare spaces. So there's never tremendous political demand for childcare. It will be done because it's the right thing to do, not because it's something you'll win an election on. You'll never win an election on this issue. On that note, let's take a break for our sponsor from space, and we'll come back. When we think of Canada and space missions, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of you, I'm betting it's the Canadarm. Remember the photos? The red maple leaf against that vast sea of blackness? Well, there's a hell of a lot more to the story. It starts in 1969 with a wholly owned Canadian company called MacDonald Detweiler and Associates, now known as MDA. Theirs is a 51-year history as an international space mission partner and a robotics, satellite systems, and geointelligence pioneer. Like any leader, it's a story of firsts. Canada is the first country with a domestic communications satellite in orbit because of MDA's contributions. They beat NASA engineers in the race to process the first image from CSAT, the world's first radar remote sensing satellite. The Hubble Space Telescope, Canadarm deployed it. MDA launched the world's first commercially focused radar satellite. They built a meteorological station on Mars, invented Dexter, a dual-armed robot for the International Space Station, and MDA has just been tapped for the third-generation Canadarm for a lunar orbiting space station. I just cherry-picked a few of over 50 firsts. Now, they're leading the charge toward viable moon colonies, enhanced Earth observation, and communication in a hyper-connected world. MDA isn't just Canada's largest space technology developer and manufacturer. They grow our economy and they advocate for an entire industry. A space company with a big Canadian flag on their backpack. You can find out more about them at www.mda.space. So, My friends, my fellow panelists, I am thoroughly confused. I am thoroughly confused about the vaccine issue and where things are at. So, I can't remember exactly the timing, but last week somehow we had the shock of the Prime Minister telling us that we needed to lower our expectations about the timing of when we would receive vaccines, and that hopefully we would have half of the population vaccinated by September of next year, and that we might be vaccinating some emergency personnel in the first quarter of this year, but certainly no max vaccinations happening the first quarter of this year. And then that started a whole debate running, and then critics started to refer to us as being at the back of the line. And then this Rosie Barton had an interview with this guy from Moderno who said, no, you're not at the back of the line. So then all the supporters of the government said, see, we're not at the back of the line. But I don't recall him saying that we were near the front of the line either. So I'm left confused as to whether Canada can expect to roughly be vaccinating its population at the same time period and at the same pace as, let's say, the G7.
Over to you, Jenni. You start.
Well, I think it's clear the answer is no. Every other G7 country is actually has actually talked about dates. So you have the European Union that had their mass vaccination. You have the US. There's actually, Pfizer actually has planes in Belgium ready to take off and land in the US once the FDA actually approves the vaccine. So the one thing that we're not hearing from is dates, although this morning, Krista Freeland was on local CBC Fredericton radio, where she said, and this should bring comfort, we will have vaccines by the summer. That's June 21st, 2021.
Okay. I share your confusion, David. I've asked 4 people that I thought should know the answer to this question, have some expertise in it. I got 4 different answers about what exactly is happening, what's the state of play, what's the likelihood. I'm going to stick with my theme for the day, the same theme I use to break down such as it is the economic statement, and that is government's got to get the big things right or ends up in peril. This is a big thing. So I don't actually know what the deal is, and I don't know when the vaccines will or will not. I've actually read in terms of dates. I've seen reports where people have said, and they're kind of that second wave of reports, as you said, they're sort of response reports that talked about, no, hang on. We should have substantial numbers of vaccines going out that certainly hit that first cohort of people, which, you're going to get the elderly and the healthcare workers, frontline workers are going to get it first. That's going to be true of every country. That could be happening in January, that we could be getting that month, 6 weeks from now. In which case, then I think that will take most of the political peril out of this. But if that's not the case, and we're looking at the end of February and people still aren't getting vaccines here, and we're watching every other G7 country, then I think that's a big thing. Then that's one of those big things that government's got to get right. And I don't know that people will be very tolerant of the arguments. And you hear arguments like, well, we don't have enough manufacturing capacity because of past decisions made by the Harper government or going back to the Mulroney government. That may be true, may not be true. I'm not sure it's going to matter a lot to people if they don't get vaccines in February and March. You may hear arguments about, well, you have to take into consideration, isn't when you start to vaccinate, it's when you end vaccinating. Again, I think that's going to be small fucking comfort to people if they're watching other people get vaccinated and they don't feel like they're making progress on this. So I don't know what the reality is. I'm also confused by it, but I'm positive that if people aren't getting needles in their arms by the end of January, it's going to be the most dangerous political issue this government's ever dealt with, by far, without question. And I would be terrified if I were them about getting pushed into an election.
So do you think they're scrambling to? Do you think they're scrambling to fix it right now? What's that, Jenni? Go ahead. Go ahead, Jenni.
No, I was going to say there's no evidence that we're having it the earliest date that people have actually, anyone in the government has talked about. Dominic LeBlanc made some kind of offhanded comment about January, but in terms of definitive dates. The earliest date that people have talked about in the government is March 31st. So 6 million vaccines, which is actually 3 million people. So it's one vaccine and a booster. And so that means 3 million people in Canada get vaccinated. And if you go by what the premiers are saying in terms of per capita, for Ontario, for example, that's 1.2 million people. So 850,000 healthcare workers, another 50,000 first responders, if not more, and 70,000 people in long-term care. So that doesn't even hit the people that are actually that have diseases and stuff, like any respiratory diseases like COPD and what have you, in terms of getting any vaccine in the first round. So I think this government is scrambling to try to scramble to explain this. But at the end of the day, there is one thing that they're not talking about, and it's dates in any time soon. And so you've got the US, you've got the EU, you've got UK, you've got even Mexico, who didn't have production capacity, regardless, like the same as what Canada has. And they're getting the vaccines, they're saying sometime in the next months. And if you have people, like you have experts like Amir Adarand and you know, I've been at the receiving end of a government on Adarand before. He is basically, he used the words, this government is lying about their production capacity and the fact that we're not getting the vaccine.
Yeah, he's a bit breathless at the best of times. So, I mean, I think the date certain thing, I'm not as convinced.
Sure you guys were fine when he was pounding the shit on us.
No, I wasn't, to be honest. I've always found, I mean, I don't want to personalize the podcast, but I've always found the guy over the top. You know, I don't know about this date certain thing. I mean, so as an example, right? You've got different platforms, right? You've got an RNA platform, you've got cold chain, you've got ones that are not cold chain. So Moderna, like when it comes to this date certain thing, I don't know exactly how hard people can get on this on a date certain, you know, because Moderna yesterday applies for regulatory approval. It's not a cold chain platform, so it's a vaccine. So now you've got, they've applied in the EU and the US yesterday. I think, like, my guess is we're going to see them apply in the next couple of days to Health Canada. And we've got doses there. So it kind of, like, it depends a little bit also on where the roulette wheel ends. Like if it lands on Moderna and they can get out and it's not cold chain, it's not as complicated and you can get it out quickly, then maybe we're in much better shape at the end of January. If it isn't.
So hopefully they'll approve vaccines faster than they approved rapid testing.
That's for sure my hope.
So let's say, wait a second. Let's just
approving rapid testing.
I've got a question about the politics, though.
The FDA was approving rapid tests. All right.
FDA was approving rapid tests. Go.
In the spring, and we approved our first one in October.
Yeah. Well, I generally like the fact that Health Canada has its own independent regulatory system and doesn't just accept from the United States. But my question about the politics of this is, if we're right that this is that the prospect of people in comparable countries, United States, England, etc., getting vaccinated and Canada not, if we're right that that's unsurvivable politically, because I certainly believe that strongly, assuming that they just realized that after they floated their trial balloon, which I can't believe, what are they and what would you do at this point to fix that? If they can buy their way out of the problem by going back to suppliers and saying, we'll pay more to get it earlier, if they can buy their way out of the problem, would you buy your way out of the problem?
For fucking sure.
Agreed.
I don't know that that's an option, though, and I don't know that that's what's going on. Like, I think it's either, well, not either, because there could be multiple things that could be true, I suppose. But, you know, it could be true that it's an unfixable problem. It could be true that it is a fixable problem, and that there was just a grossly incoherent communication of this issue 10 days ago. where, maybe people were sitting around saying, okay, well, let's be calm and rational, but this is the way it goes. It doesn't matter when you start, it matters when you end, and we need to say this. And, we'll just tell people, like, don't raise expectations. Like, that's going to be the political pair there. You don't want to raise expectations. So let's say March 31st. And then they realize, holy shit, when we put that into the ecosystem, it turned into a giant fire-breathing dragon and burned our village down. So we better stop saying that. It could be that.
Or they're on the defensive because when other countries were in the negotiation and getting these drugs, they were too busy trying to protect their friends, the Kielburgers, and were not focused on actually what other countries were doing in terms of vaccine procurement. So they put all the eggs in the Cancino basket in terms of that deal, which they signed on May the 12th. And so I think that the reason that they're scrambling right now is because they're on the defensive because they know they actually fucked up.
Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't.
Well, I don't know anything about the substance of this. I really don't, and I can't hold myself forward as an expert. But I do know that it can't go down this way for the Liberals. They've got to find a way. They've got to find a way that this is not true, because I just don't see how a minority makes it through months of that going on.
There's a Leger poll that just came out just in the last hour, since we started, that says that this is not an issue with the public. The 37% of people are very concerned, but 48% are not. I can't believe. I mean, David, you're the pollster. Leger's a good polling outfit. You respect them, right? I've always respected them. But I just can't believe that's.
But Scott, that accurate. Same poll actually showed if you look at the approval rates, I saw the poll as well. If you look at the approval rates from all of the premiers from what their spring rating was until what it is now, it's actually gone down fairly significantly because people are starting to pay more attention to this. And so it's easy to say that that Canadians aren't concerned right now about vaccines, but let's see in the next. It
may not be first in the discussion yet. You mean?
Let's see in the next 3 months if the Americans and the Australians and the Brits are all getting needles in arms, and we're sitting there thinking that we're going to get 6 million doses at the end of March. I guarantee you those poll numbers are going to be completely wrong. They're completely different than what they are right now.
I think that's right. I buy that.
I haven't seen the Leger poll, and I don't know, and I do respect Leger, but I haven't seen what question they asked, and I'll respond with qualitative, which is I was in my local hardware store in Ziffel store in Baltimore the other day, and it was after the Prime Minister had made his remarks, and the staff in the store were all aware of it. These are people that don't talk politics and don't follow federal politics that closely. But they were all aware of it, and it had depressed all of them because it made them think we were in for another year.
Right.
And it just was sort of something that had put a reality in front of them that this is going to be a longer haul than they'd hoped. And so that if turns out to be a longer haul than is necessary or a longer haul than others, I think that runs pretty hard.
Can I ask you guys a superficial question? I've taken some bad stories into election campaigns, and I recognize one when I see one. I buy all that. I think this has got Jeopardy sprawled across it in large flashing letters, and it's just got the worst version of what we've been talking about can't be permitted to occur, or it's going to be a big box of fucking political trouble. Just will be. So
it's going to be an O'Toole government is what it's going to be.
My superficial question is this. Are you guys scared of needles?
No.
I never used to be scared of needles. And somewhere along the line, the last 10 years, I've started to become kind of scared of needles. I kind of dread it when I have to go and get blood. I can't look at them, put the needle in my arm. I think about it before I go. I don't want to do it. Flu shot, I'm sitting around thinking, when are they going to put it in? When are they going to put it in? Are they putting it in? Oh, shit, there, they put it in. I don't know, man. I'm just getting scared of needles. But I guess I'm going to have to overcome that, at least by March 31st, right, Jenni? Or summer?
Well, no, you're shit out of luck. There's no way you'll get it.
What happens this summer? Is that when your diabetes kicks in?
That's right. That's right. No, but I'm high risk, man. I had lung disease. Come on. I'm pushing I'm almost a senior.
I have asthma too, but I don't think I'm getting it.
I don't know.
So listen, we had a viewer, a listener, could have been a viewer, could have been a listener. And if you are a listener, know that you could be a viewer. This is on the YouTube machine, and God, Reid is handsome.
Huh?
In all of his glory, Reid is something to...
And his glasses, for those not watching, his glasses match his shirt today.
I always do that.
Always.
You can't see my shoes, but there's blues. There's blues upon it.
Anyway, a listener or a viewer said to us that we had, in our discussion about floor crossers, had neglected to talk about David Emerson. And I didn't bring Emerson up in that conversation because I consider Emerson a bit of a unique case because he wasn't really a partisan of either side. But we all have aspects of this Emerson story to tell. I actually don't know Jenni's version of this story. I don't really know how he was recruited to you.
Well, you guys go ahead, and I'll tell you what I know afterwards.
Okay, so I was involved in the recruitment of David Emerson to run. It was in the lead up to the 2004 election, and we wanted to attract some very significant, we had ambitions for British Columbia. We wanted to attract some very significant candidates in British Columbia and people that represented the real economy of British Columbia. And so David Emerson was a huge catch for us. And because it was 2004 and because we were trying to win 200 seats and be everything to everybody, we at the same time recruited Ujjal Dosanjh and Dave Haggard, who was a major union leader in British Columbia.
He was a great guy.
To run for us and to be a great guy and be the lead of our British Columbia team. And it was for, by our standards, quite successful. The party increased its vote and its seat count in BC in both the 2004 and 2006 election campaigns. Nothing like the success that Trudeau has had there, but for the party in that stage, important gains in British Columbia. And Emerson was a part of that, but he had obviously never been partisan before that. He didn't take to that role well of being a political minister. He had staff who sort of helped him get around, but so it didn't surprise me that he didn't feel any tremendous loyalty to the Liberal Party. But what did surprise me was that he moved to the Harper Conservatives because in the latter stages of the campaign, when it appeared likely we would lose, I was on the receiving end of a number of desperate calls from David Emerson, talking about what an unbelievable tragedy it would be if Stephen Harper came to office, how catastrophic it would be for Canada if Stephen Harper came to office. And he was encouraging me to think of policy and campaign initiatives that were quite dramatic, if you might say, and even more dramatic than the things I was considering, which, if you can believe that. So, involving things like pipeline policy, etc. So he seemed to think that Harper, my last conversation with him was that a Stephen Harper government was a catastrophe beyond imagining. And so the next thing I saw from David Emerson was him accepting a position in the Harper cabinet. So Jenni, over to you.
So what did Brian Mulroney say? There's no whore like an old whore?
Yeah. When I found out about, we had a transition team that was mostly made up in 2006, was mostly made up of old Tories, so from the PC side of the party. And there was never actually any, there was never any friction between the two, except for this. And so you had a bunch of old PC people who were doing transition. And so as the transition happened and any of the people being tasked to be chiefs of staff or being interviewed were all from the PC side of things. And it became a very big deal within our party. And so Ian Brodie, who was the chief of staff at the time, he brought me in to do to help with basically leveling the playing field and taking over staffing, which is what I ended up doing for the first
year of the Harper government as well. And I remember coming in, it was during transition and everything was secret. And one of the things that everyone that had been through transition told me is transition will be the worst time of any political staffer's life because it takes forever and you will never know what's going on, which is exactly accurate. And so I remember going up to the 4th floor of Langevin, way towards the end, like past where the correspondence women were, like where the secure room was. The only other times I'd been there is for like security briefings when things were going on, like in the Middle East or Ukraine. And so anyways, after that, obviously, and I remember sitting there and Ian going through some of the cabinet ministers, and there was not, like most were not surprises. So it was like, oh, okay, well, Rana Ambrose's environment, this is interesting. And then all of a sudden it was like David Emerson, and I'm like, whoa, what? Anyway, so that was kind of, and so that was like, it was a huge deal for us. Like people were like, I remember being back at Party HQ where I watched the swearing in and people like being absolutely stunned. But I think to your point, he was just in dealing with him. He was so not partisan that it didn't between like Harper and Martin. I don't think it didn't matter to him.
And he didn't understand what he was doing because he immolated himself like he'd been dumped in napalm or something like that. Like that was the end of his political career immediately.
I'll just add one little footnote to this. I remember when he was being recruited, he came to Ottawa. This is before the election, and it was you or Cadario. Somebody had asked me to meet with him and talk about, what he was in for and start to talk about how, if he was a candidate, the political communication, what would happen, all that kind of stuff. So we went and we had breakfast, and I liked him a lot. I was immediately struck by, he seemed like a very decent, thoughtful guy, very capable, clearly a former CEO, like was used to kind of like, okay, how do I find a mode to make decisions, take decisions? How will that world translate into this world? I liked him a lot. And I never got to know him really. We never became like super close or anything like that, but my relations with him while he was in cabinet were always cordial and decent. During that last election campaign in 2006, which was not as much fun for me as it was for Jenni. He reached out a couple times, we chat. So I was surprised when he made the move, but I've never held it against him like others did for all the same reasons that you, David. And because I thought that he was an example of reach into the private sector, reach into other worlds and draw people into public life. And I didn't think he appreciated the fact that taking a position in Harper's cabinet meant that he had just violated a sort of fundamental principle of team ball. I didn't think he looked at it that way. I didn't think he felt about it that way. And so I know a lot of my friends who were BC Liberals, some of whom worked for him and stuff, felt very personally wounded, very angry. I never really carried that resentment. Because I sort of cut him slack on it, saying, that's not the world from which he came. I'm sure there was self-interest in, hey, I'd like to continue being a minister, I'd like to feel important, all that kind of stuff. These guys want me. That's kind of cool. But I never, I chalked it up to, this guy decided he was going to do this for the next stage of his life. He did it. And I didn't think that he felt the party stripe mattered that much. I did not have the experience you did. I don't remember him calling me in the last stages of the 06 campaign saying, we got to lock him in a room with the lady of the night and, cocaine and something like that and see if we can get Harper trapped. I never had those kinds of calls. So I never added that complexion to it.
But this is kind of what we've talked about before, is just because someone's successful in business or another profession does not make them necessarily good at politics.
But he wasn't bad. He wasn't great at politics.
Well, no, but he violated. Go back to our original conversation. He didn't understand, in terms of the partisan thing, he didn't understand the role that loyalty plays in party politics. So he was immediately, to go back to our conversation last week, neither fish nor fowl. Liberals hated his guts. Conservatives presumably never trusted him or welcomed him in. And the second thing is that in terms of the voters, if your point of view is that I'm so good that regardless of what party I'm with, I deserve to be the person, most times people aren't going to agree with you on that. And so you may have cut him a lot of slack for his decision. The voters of his riding did not cut him any slack for that decision. They wanted him out immediately. Yeah. Hey, there was we shouldn't dwell on this, but it is fun. There was an interesting little thing happened in the last week, which is that the Prime Minister met with the Leader of the Opposition. Justin Trudeau met with Erin O'Toole, and we got to read about the meeting before it happened. And it was super interesting because you know that after reading about the meeting, that the actual meeting's got to be quite something. A, how does this happen in an office? And B, what does it tell us? What is the significance of this, if anything? Jenni?
Oh, well, I just think it's sloppy. It's extremely sloppy. Obviously, they had a script going in. They probably had talking points for the PM to have on certain points that he was going to make to Erin. The fact of the matter is after they leaked the talking points prior to the actual meeting happening, he obviously didn't bring it up on the call. And if he did, they didn't do a readout. So it went from what was seemingly a scolding by the Prime Minister to Erin turned into like just a very general call that he would have had anyone that he was briefing. So it was kind of the worst of all worlds. It's incompetence. It's off your message. I don't even know what else to say.
Okay, so what it tells me is that the meeting was a prop. It tells me that the meeting wasn't a real consultative effort. The meeting was an occasion for the government to deliver a political message about on behalf of itself. So why are these people meeting if they have no intention of actually meeting? Like that wasn't the readout of a meeting. That was the readout of a political interaction.
It's so the Prime Minister can say that that he briefed the opposition, so they can't be surprised to what is happening or not happening. I think probably mostly this was in the height of vaccines, so I think that was probably the initial intent. And the opposition can say, well, listen, we're the big cracker at the cracker factory because the Prime Minister is briefing us as to what's happening in the country regarding COVID.
I think you guys are being way too harsh. Okay, like I can't help but look at this thing through the lens of a former staffer, former comm staffer, somebody that would have for sure and was on occasion freighted with the responsibility of drafting up a readout and then arranging for it. And I like the word that's missing from this conversation is fuck up. It's a fuck up, okay? And we can be damning and saying, how can this level of competence possibly exist? And how can this level of craven preparedness be permitted? It happens. Of course you prepare a readout of meetings between leaders, of meetings between world leaders. And, so it's not a leak. It wasn't like it deliberately leaked. It was a fuck up. Somebody hit click and then sat at their computer, and I've done it, and went, oh my shit. Oh my God. Oh God, that went to the gallery. Oh my God, I'm going to die now. And I've lived through fuck ups like that. And it's
but you're focusing on the mechanistic process of how it actually got out. I'm not interested in that. Of course, that's the way it happened. Of course, somebody hit send on something
matters,
that wasn't
because it matters
supposed to be hit and send. But what it reveals is the thinking behind the meeting.
Well, yeah.
Right? What it reveals is that the meeting was part of a strategy that they had planned. Whoever hit send, whoever made that mistake, didn't invent the strategy of the readout. And if you had written that readout for Paul, it was because you were an integral part of the strategy meetings and you would have known exactly what the strategy was for having that meeting and what was supposed to be conveyed in that meeting. So that's what that reveals to us, right?
But I don't know. Like, are we astonished? Are we three astonished that when the Prime Minister asks the Leader of the Opposition to come in and have a discussion in the middle of all this, that there's a strategy and a notion of what you want to achieve behind it? I thought no, but I'm interested.
I'm interested that the strategy was not to convince him to come out and have some joint show of uniform support for the
Right.
country during COVID or some sort of consensus. The purpose of the meeting was to highlight a difference between them, not to forge a consensus between them. That's not a meeting.
Fair enough. I assume there is no ground for consensus between them, and I don't, we could ascribe blame for who that on that, but I just don't think. I think a conversation between them was by definition a political act that was intended for communication and political purposes, and this laid that bare in a way that's embarrassing and awkward, but not in the least bit surprising. I mean, I've mentioned this to you, David. Like, I remember in 2004, in a much less structured situation, Dalton McGuinty came to Ottawa and met with Paul. Remember, he was talking about the fiscal imbalance. He wanted $23 billion immediately. And Paul was meeting with Dalton in his office in Center Block. I'm in the office next to it. And I started drafting up what I hoped was going to be the statement that would emerge from it. His chief of staff, Don Guy, who I think everyone here knows, marches into the room, sees that I'm drafting this, and has like a fit and says, "My God, this is all orchestrated in theater, and you guys have already decided in and all this stuff." And I was kind of like, "What the fuck are you on about? Come on! Like this is just I'm just preparing for a possible outcome." I didn't send it to the press gallery, but he was like affronted, which I frankly assumed then and I assume now was theater. But these things happen. You have a meeting and you write it up. Maybe you write up two of them. Maybe you have a bunch of like static paragraphs and you stick a fungible paragraph in there depending upon what you think the outcome was or might be. But
why was Don able to stroll
happens.
into your office and look at your computer screen?
Well, because we're that suite of offices in at Center Block. In the Prime Minister's office, he was up there and kicking around, and I wasn't.
You were in the open area where all those offices, like.
Yeah, and so he
connected.
slipped into the office next to the PM. I was just sitting at a desk, and I don't know, it might have been a piece of paper on the desk that I drafted or whatever, but it wasn't inappropriate for him to wander in. We've known each other for 10 years, 20 years at that time, so he came in and shot the shit, and then he looked at it and acted like it was a great affront to the legitimacy of the meeting, and like imagine then, like. People talk about, provincial premiers. There's a provincial Liberal premier just jamming a mop up our ass every fucking day on a fiscal imbalance. God. Anyway, bygones.
All right. I think it's that time of it is that time of the show. It is the time for our new segment, Hey You, where we shout a question out into the void to somebody in the hopes that it provokes a response or stimulates debate or just gets something off of our chest. Scott, what's your Hey You today?
All right, I think I'm breaking with the not yet established tradition of the Hey You construct, because my Hey You isn't a complaint or a criticism of someone. My Hey You is to Lisa Raitt, former deputy leader of the party. She's been doing a bit of a media tour talking about early onset Alzheimer's that her husband suffers from, talking about the difficulty, the outbursts that she experiences as his spouse, as his behavior is erratic at times, not at others. I just thought it was a really brave thing to talk about. I joke around about my Aunt Doris. There was an Aunt Doris in my life, and she was my great Aunt Doris. And she was like this lovely little lady, widow from Campbellford, Ontario, went to church, was in the Ladies of the Eastern Star, the whole bit. And then when she got Alzheimer's, she'd be like, in the home, and she'd look up at me and she'd go, "Get out of here, you motherfucking cocksucker, son of a bitch, you no good prick." And it was horrifying because my Aunt Doris never spoke that way in her whole life. She would never have said those words once. And so it felt like it was hollowing out who she was. So what Lisa said resonated with me, and I think she deserves credit for it.
Yeah, for sure. Jenni, Hey You?
Well, my Hey You is still political. So my Hey You is actually to Doug Ford and the Ontario government, because I have now been watching this love affair between Doug and Justin Trudeau for the last 8 months. And Doug came out yesterday and asked Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca when Ontario would be getting their vaccines. But my Hey You would be, Doug, when are you actually going to ask the Prime Minister, who is responsible for, his government is responsible for approving and acquiring those vaccines that Ontarians need?
All right. And My hey you is to Premier Ford also, and it is a plea to rectify the unfairness of the big box store versus small retailer situation. Small retailers will not survive Christmas if they don't have access to sell anything. Maybe we should be looking at a Manitoba model, but certainly the bizarre unfairness that you can buy a television at Loblaws but not at the audio shop in Ottawa, or that you can buy books at Walmart but not at Indigo, is not an acceptable outcome and not a fair outcome. And I'd ask them to reconsider and revisit that. That's my hey you for today. Anybody got anything to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, it's snowing and I hate it. And my kid is home because there's been a third outbreak of COVID in his class since September 1st. And you know what? It's going to be one shit winter, man. It's going to be one shit winter. You can't have a 7-year-old at home learning online and do anything. My productivity is somewhere between alcoholic and asleep. That's how much I get done on a daily basis right now. This is the longest I've sat in front of my computer since that occurred. And
can I ask you a serious question?
Yeah.
How's his reading
I'm
coming
joking,
along?
but I'm actually serious. Huh?
How's his reading coming along?
Well, Sam's a great reader. Sam was.
No, I understand that, but this is an important year for those kinds of subjects. And how is his learning doing this year?
Yeah. Well, reading isn't his issue. His issue is math, right? If there's a subject that he finds challenging, it's math. And, I think for a lot of kids, this year is going to be a scrub. And I think teachers are doing their best. I think schools are doing their best. But, it's a constant interruption. Like everything about the learning process is a constant interruption. You're no longer in class, you're now online. You're online for 40 minutes, then you break off online. Oh, you can't get the Google Classroom working, you can't download the materials. Okay, well just do something at home, draw it on a sheet of paper. You know what? You didn't get that done. You ended up having a banana instead. It's all like everything just kind of falls by the side. So it's a steady river of small compromises that add up to something much less than the typical learning experience by the time it's over. And I assume when the year is done, that this year will not be a completed year for Sam, for Ben, and for the schoolings of other kids that are in public schools across the province and country.
Yeah, it's a tragedy that these children are not in the future going to remember nearly the number of things from high school classes that I remember.
Well, that's the most profound tragedy of this entire experience. You put your thumb on it, David.
Who the fuck remembers anything they learned in high school anyway, for God's sake? Anyway, thank you all for joining. Jenny, thank you for being here. Scott, thank you for being here. Air Quotes Media, particularly Jill Engelman and Metal Donkers Good, thank you for your help. Listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in. Margaret MacMillan was with us this week, and what a pleasure that was to be able to talk to.
Speaking of Sam, he's making a guest appearance.
Sam, how are you?
Say hi, Jenny. Hi.
There we go.
Jenny.
Hi.
Hey, Uncle David.
Sam, is my hair
go
too
sit
short?
in front of your computer and just like it.
All right, we'll see you all next Tuesday. Take care.
Bye.